everybody. Welcome to our next virtual meeting on safety in context, a renewable energy asset and its life cycle perspective. Obviously, the meeting will be recorded for training and promotional purposes, and it will be locked shortly for security purposes. Any questions that are asked in the chat facility will be collated and the answers provided via our recent events page. We will go through the questions as they're asked. So if you have got any questions, then please put them in the chat. We've got IOSH overview and updates, our guest speaker, Rakesh. We've got a Q&A session that follows, and then ask the committee session after that, and then final remarks, and hopefully we should all be done by 3:30. Our next few months we'll be continuing via Zoom until further notice. We're hoping that the meetings in 2022 will become hybrid, that mix of face-to-face and online. Once we get to that stage, we'll provide you with details. The next few events will all be online. It's December the 16th. We've got a membership event, which covers competency framework and the IOSH grades. And then on January the 27th, we go to crisis management. Obviously, they might change due to speakers, COVID, and other unforeseen circumstances. IOSH news. So we have a new president. For those who haven't noticed, Louise Hoskins has been announced as the new IOSH president at the recent AGM. So as she becomes president, Jimmy Quinn moves to the role of immediate past president, and Lawrence Webb becomes the president-elect. That also means we have 3 new vice presidents, Joanna Price, Angela Abbs, and Richard Bate, who are joining the existing VP Stuart Hughes, Dr. David Gold, and Neil Catton. So, leadership skills. Why don't you enhance your leadership skills with the IOSH CPD course? How well do you manage your own workload? How about influencing directors or peers? IOSH's forthcoming CPD course, enhancing leadership skills to improve competency, should help you with all of these plus more, and you can register via the link. So over to our guest speaker, Rakesh Maharaj. Hopefully I've pronounced that right, Rakesh. Qualified as an occupational hygienist and epidemiologist in South Africa. Rakesh has been working in research, academic industry, and advisory roles across his 24-year career. Though his fascination and skill set lies in global transformation, he cannot escape the horrors of workplace fatalities, particularly within the energy sector, and has led panels of inquiry into 16 fatalities across 10 different countries and acted as defense expert witness. He uses lessons learned to redesign and reorganize rapidly growing independent power producers, investment platforms, and slow-to-turn national utility companies. Rakesh holds an MBA in applied system thinking and international business, and has spoken at several World Congress events about deriving tangible business value from safety in safety-critical organizations. Today, he leads ARMSA, an advisory and decision-making improvement practice based in Manchester, and works with clients ranging from South America to the Pacific Rim. As I said earlier, if you've got any questions for Rakesh during his chat, then please put them in our chat facility and use the posting to everyone. So, over to you, Rakesh.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Keith. I'm going to try and share my screen. That was a fabulous introduction, by the way. I almost had to look again to make sure it was me. And here we are. Presumably, everybody's looking at my screen and slides. Is that correct?
Yep.
Fantastic. Well, once again, thank you to the committee and members of the South Wales branch for having me deliver to you today. We're going to be talking about, or I'm going to be talking about a subject that I'm incredibly passionate about, and that is understanding safety in context. This is quite a comprehensive area, and I'm going to try and condense this into 40+ minutes, so do wish me luck. The first thing that I'm sure hasn't escaped us, given all of the news coverage we've been receiving over it, is COP26. COP26 has just concluded just over a week ago, and according to the COP26 president, we have reached an agreement, and the agreement is that if all countries fulfill their commitments, we will only increase global warming by 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050. That's a big ask. It's a big ask because of many, many reasons. I work within power generation, so let's explore the power generation perspective. Only second to transport, the power generation sector is the second largest contributor to CO2 emissions around the world. The International Renewable Energy Association has looked closely into scenario planning for the future in order to try and understand what the most optimum trajectory would be in terms of developing renewable installations in order to replace existing fossil fuel installations or power plants. And what they've estimated is that we will require around 17,000 gigawatts of additional renewable assets by 2050, which, if you think about it, bringing it home, around 8.5 thousand direct power station equivalents. That is a massive, massive ask. But in addition to these renewable installations, we have other key considerations like energy security, given the unpredictable nature of natural energy resources such as wind and sunshine. How secure will our energy security, how secure will our energy supply be, and how flexible will it be? IRENA also did an additional study based on their modeling. And what they found is that in order to build, operate, and maintain the 17,000 gigawatts worth of power installations, that we're going to need 40 million power professionals and supply chain employees working in this sector worldwide by 2050. And in order to hit that 1.5 degrees in 2050, 24 million of them need to be employed by 2030. And just to bring this challenge home to us, that's in 9 years from now. We don't have a lot of time. Those safety professionals amongst us will probably be thinking, oh my gosh, how is this ever going to be managed? One of the challenges that I often find in practice is a challenge that Einstein sums up in one of his very famous sayings, that you can't solve problems using the thinking that's created them. In other words, we need a new form of thinking. Now, safety in design certainly isn't a new form of thinking. But what it is a practice that is completely without direction, without drive, without competence, and without incentive and motivation across the energy industry. In fact, traditional construction still prevails today among some of the largest offshore wind installations that I advise on. And as long as we continue with traditional construction, as long as we continue with traditional construction, we will always depend upon procedural safety control, relying on people, relying on process in order to keep themselves and others safe. But as humans, we all learn from making mistakes. So we're not always going to follow those procedures, or in writing them, we're not always going to get that right. So does that mean, as we begin to accelerate towards 2050, thinking about those 40 million people that need to be employed, beggars belief as to what the accident and incident rate might look like if we are going to continue with the traditional construction paradigm? Now, integrated procurement, development, and design is a concept that's born out of the US, but not unfamiliar to us here in the UK or elsewhere in Europe. Because what it does propose is it proposes the design and development of effective front-end loading in terms of risk elimination and mitigation, producing assets that are inherently safe on paper first, and then relying less on procedures when controlling their construction and operational phases. And if we're able to do that, then we are relying much less on procedural control during operations and maintenance, when the majority of people are going to be in contact with these assets onshore or offshore throughout their 30 to 35-year design life. Whilst to most of us as safety professionals, this logic makes total sense. The need to move from traditional construction mindsets into integrated procurement, development, and design is totally logical because it allows us to maximize the effectiveness of our risk reduction. To our commercial, contractual, financial, investor leaders, this also needs to make sense. One of the key metrics driving development and investment in the renewable market is what we call levelized cost of energy. And for companies to realize a decent return on investment, their levelized cost of energy doesn't only need to be as low as possible, it also needs to be predictable. And herein lies the problem. Because as long as we are dependent upon traditional construction, then during the rest of the asset life cycle, when people make mistakes, when procedures fall foul of being inaccurate, this brings about unplanned plant breakdowns, increased maintenance work, traveling out to hazardous environments. And from a financial perspective, we have an unpredictable levelized cost of energy. But by adopting an integrated procurement, development, and design approach, what this does to the financial curve is begin to make it very appealing for investors. Simply because by reducing the chances of errors having material impacts on asset reliability, human safety, as well as asset predictability and availability, we also have a predictable levelized cost of energy, because we'd be able to drive down and maintain a relatively low level of operational costs during the O&M phase of our asset life cycles. And what we are finding within the renewable industry is that a huge challenge exists, particularly in terms of connecting the safety message and the commercial message. And hopefully, this is a really good starting point. The offshore sector, as well as large onshore sectors, are not without their complications. There are several work packages involved that need to come together to create a generating wind farm that is reliable and available when the wind blows. So as you can see, there are 5 distinct elements of work packages that have to come together. Support structures, wind turbine technologies in the form of turbines themselves and their foundations, the electrical grid, both onshore and offshore, transportation, installation and logistics, onshore operations and maintenance. This is like a symphony. Bringing it together is a challenge, and it doesn't come without proper planning, proper evaluation, detailed front-end assessment, obsession with design and mitigation of design risks, as well as good decision-making. But the organizations that are developing these assets are in themselves challenged. Because how are you able to maintain continuity in your thought process regarding hazard identification, risk mitigation, if all you are doing is working on paper for the first 5 years of the development of this complex offshore wind farm, where you have development teams working with site survey teams, who are then working with licensing teams and consent teams, who are then working with procurement and financing teams before we even achieve what we call financial investment decisions. Conventional approach to construction dictates that you cut your costs as much as possible up front until you know you're ready to build. And this is where we find challenges within the sector that we work. The 5 years create some big challenges to maintain continuity in the hazard identification and risk data flow as they begin to snowball throughout these processes all the way into construction. This is where system-based decision-making becomes incredibly important. Because unlike the minimum requirements that we have in regulations such as CDM, as well as all of the other subordinate regs, there are key decisions that developers, constructors, procurement professionals within the wind and other renewable industries make that actually directly affect the outcome of projects in construction and operation and maintenance phase. And it is rather unfortunate that the guidance, that the regulations, and even the HSE's enforcement model that we have today do not proactively focus on the criticalities of these decisions. So what decisions am I talking about? The decisions that I'm talking about are we going to be issuing detailed specifications or functional specifications? How are we going to be preparing and distributing our tenders? Who are we going to be distributing them to? And what is the market preparedness to respond to these tenders from a competency and capability standpoint? What's the commercial strategy we're going to adopt? Is it going to be a multi-contract strategy? Is it going to be an EPC strategy? Because each of those hugely affects project control. How are we going to go about evaluating bids? Are we going to be applying our standard pre-qualification processes where we evaluate historical safety performance, number of accidents, number of fatalities? Do you have an ISO or accredited system of management? Do you have competent people? Can I have a look at what your risk assessments look like? Or are we going to move from that into Have you delivered the scope of work before? What were the key risks that you've identified in delivering the scope of work? How do you propose to mitigate them on this project? What management, supervisory, and technical skills do you intend to deploy to deliver the scope of work, and why? Those types of questions in evaluating bids are far more effective in terms of understanding the readiness of a contractor or a series of contractors to work alongside us to deliver our projects. How do we initiate our projects? Do we initiate our projects merely by holding safety days, by induction training, or do we initiate our projects by actually setting out intelligent client charters right at the very outset? Do we recognize that it is our project plan, our integrated master schedules, that more directly impact the manner in which work is undertaken on the ground than our construction safety plans do? Are we going to emphasize the need for adopting risk-based monitoring strategies, or are we just going to walk around doing behavioral-based observations? Are we going to move more towards task risk controls, or are we still going to be fascinated about whether people are wearing hard hats and safety boots when they should? And then finally, when we are reviewing our work scopes with our contractors, are we going to be talking to them about how badly or how well they've done? Or are we going to start inviting them to comment about how we as the client have done in terms of equipping them to execute their projects safely and effectively? As a result of this, you can see that the challenge that we as safety professionals have goes well beyond the current thinking of risk assessment, hazard identification, and control, but actually by working deeper with organizations to understand how they go about making decisions and choices that result in, ultimately, systems of work and whether they're safe or not. So here's one example. Majority of companies that I work with have no understanding of how the types of specifications they develop impacts the responsibility for the system of work. So talking to my clients about the two typical types of specifications, your detailed or descriptive specifications on one hand of the spectrum, or one end of the spectrum, versus a performance or functional spec on the other end of the spectrum. Each requires a different supply chain with a different skill set and a different project management organization. A performance and functional spec generally requires a design and build and execution competencies, whereas a detailed spec requires labor, and skilled labor at that. But it goes beyond that, because performance-based specifications, the functional specifications, places the safe system of work within the ambit of your main contractor, whereas a client issuing a detailed specification places the safe system of work requirement within the client's hands. And if that were the case, then we would require a project management organization on the client side who is technically skilled. Whereas here we would require a project management organization that's assurance orientated. So before we even start looking at how we go about doing pre-qualification of contractors in our supply chain, we need to make some critical decisions about our project management organization skill sets, our type of contractors that we secure, what skill sets they bring to the table, and who's accountable for safe systems of work, just by virtue of putting pen to paper right at the very beginning. This is the level of systemic decision-making that exists within organizations that are high reliability oriented. But we need this type of thinking within a rapidly growing high-risk sector such as the renewable marketplace. Another key factor that clients often in the renewable market often tend to ignore, rather out of ignorance instead of choosing to neglecting to take it into account, is the difference between contracting strategies. And contracting strategies play a huge role in determining how work is controlled on the ground. So your two typical contracting strategies are EPC, which is typically the type of strategy that you see. So that's a tier 1, and another tier 1, and then tier 2. And CDM regulations typically imply a contracting strategy which is EPC orientated, command and control. But in order to get projects moving quickly and in order to maximize return on investment, the renewable markets generally adopt multi-contract arrangements where you have a client organization sat in the center, either a utility company or an investment platform or an independent power producer, and they issue contracts to main work package holders. And when they do so often without the project management capability that sits at the client level. So they instead bring in project management organizations through outsourced work packages to coordinate the delivery of projects. But herein lies the problem. Whilst the PMO, the outsourced PMO, might have a contractual responsibility with the client to coordinate the project delivery and therefore impose the construction safety plan, thereby impose control, collaboration, cooperation between contractors. The primary relationship sits between the contractor and the client by virtue of the contract. So instead of paying attention to the control mechanism that the PMO wishes to implement, they would rather focus on fulfilling the requirements of the contract for obvious reasons, and rightfully so. They need to get paid. So removing or separating or disaggregating levers such as these create strategic breakdowns in terms of achieving proper control of work, as well as residual hazards and risks on site. And often in some instances, not often, thankfully, but in some instances, you find safety key performance indicators being put into a contract, which actually detract tier 1 contractors and their supply chains from fulfilling proactive responsibilities required in the construction safety plan. These are often in the form of how many site inspections are we doing a week? How quickly do we report incidents and accidents? When the construction safety plan is focused on proactively planning work, identifying hazards and risks, and mitigating them before work execution. So if you're a tier 1 contractor delivering work on the ground and you are lean on resources, what would you allocate your resources to? Would it be towards the construction safety plan and fulfilling its requirements, or would it be to meeting the requirements of the contract, which is ultimately a vehicle for payment? I think the answer to that is a fairly rhetorical one. The challenges go on. Now, something that we know reasonably well is the requirement to undertake design assessments from a life cycle standpoint. And this often receives a big tick on site today. The UK, in comparison to Europe and elsewhere in the world, we're advised, is years ahead in terms of being able to do life cycle design assessments. And we often are challenged in this area because we work with an international supply chain where we engage with tier 1 suppliers who will need to fulfill designer responsibilities as well as principal designer responsibilities, simply do not have the skill sets or the experience to do so in any meaningful way. But here are some other considerations. Often, the concept of an integrated master schedule is one that is not taken seriously by the health and safety fraternity. Yet ultimately, it is the hymn sheet from which a construction project is run. Two key reasons. Number one, it contains something called a COD. It's the commercial operation delivery date of a power asset. In other words, the date at which the asset needs to start delivering energy to grid. That date's very important because it's often included in contract with funders, investors, banks, and other shareholders. So the commercial operation date is often fixed in stone, but it also includes a number of milestones. And when projects are running late and the milestones are delayed, it begins to curtail the schedule and compress the schedule, which means we have more people coming on site, working longer hours, more interface activities and simultaneous operations, much of which is ignored as a form of design risk. But in reality, it is. Why? Because the integrated master schedule is a design that determines how people come together throughout a construction project. Asset design is certainly improving. We are finding that technology development and enhancements are allowing us to develop bigger, better, more powerful wind assets, which we are pushing further and further out to sea. That's absolutely brilliant. The challenge for the safety professional is that often these new innovations are untested. They are growing at a pace that is beyond their ability to be desktop tested. And we're beginning to find failures within assets that are further out to sea than we've seen before, which means we've got to send people out to deeper waters, more inclement conditions, in order to repair assets more often than we need to. Asset design is an area that really needs to be improved upon, and the quality of that asset design will determine ultimately how safe our people are by reducing the frequency of their offshore visits. What we do have to focus on as we gallop towards the 17,000 gigawatt installation is that design is not just about civil, it's not just about electrical, it's not just about mechanical, it's about process, assets, and people. Principal designers of today will need to make a massive leap to be able to collectively look at all of those design impacts, but it is required if we are to keep people safe. The next aspect I'd like to talk about, which is key from a decision-making standpoint, is project management. Because there are a number of decisions within capital investment projects that directly affect not only the safety of a project, but also the quality of work and ultimately the reliability of the asset. One of the key ones that we grapple with on a regular basis is not being able to lock down our scope well in advance of project kickoff. And because we don't lock down the scope of the project well in advance, it means that we're often changing things. We're changing the order of things. Equipment's not going to be ready on time. Certain vessels that are specific to a project may not be available on time due to weather conditions. Contractors, specialist contractors who are few and far between, might be delayed on other projects. Or indeed, in some instances, we decide to change the location of our substations. Long after we have agreed with contractors the scope of work and the work package values for their respective work packages. And this is the one aspect that creates quite a number of problems. Financial problems, resource problems, capability problems, capacity problems, management problems, and oversight problems. Because we do not cater for these well enough by locking down the scope early, of course, we always have to include contingency, but contingency is different from scope creep. And if our scope is creeping, we are actually imposing a requirement upon our contractors to perhaps do work that they haven't planned for, they may not have the right competencies for, nor they may have the right equipment or time to do. But by dangling a very, very valuable paycheck in front of them, we are making it certainly very appealing for them to have a good go at it. And this is ultimately the price that is paid by those who are working on the ground, giving their best day in and day out. Master planning has a lot to offer organizations, only if we are clear about what the scope is before we conclude our master planning process. Organizations need to improve on these. The next is the over-reliance and relevance of the construction phase health and safety plan or project safety plan. Working on projects throughout Europe, even in the UK, as well as Central America and South America, the concept of a project safety plan or a construction phase safety plan is not uncommon. We see this all around the world. But unfortunately, there is another common element that we find associated with this. And that is these plans are generic. And that the reason that they are generic, most often than not, is because they are not informed by the key input factors, such as the design risk assessments, such as scope changes, such as integrated master schedules, and other factors that will change the nature and profile of hazards and risks on a project. One of the key challenges that I often find happening is that the integrated master schedule often is changed because of all of the factors I mentioned earlier on, which then increases the amount of simultaneous operations that are required on site in order to keep a project on track, in order to hit that COD that's cast in stone. And that creates massive interface management challenges because we've got several contractors working on a large site in rather difficult environments and conditions. One that our PMOs are not equipped to handle in terms of resources, in terms of skill sets, and in terms of being able to plan early. Why is this a problem? This is a problem because of the following. A system of work, or more importantly, a safe system of work, is devised through the choices we make. By having the right number of people doing a job, with the right skills, technical skills, task skills, process skills, doing the right job in terms of the specification of the scope of the task, with the right tools and processes at the right place and at the right time. It is these choices that we make in terms of designing a job, hence another example of design, that determines whether the job or the task is inherently safe. Because when we start making compromises in terms of these decisions, that is when we begin to create dysfunction in the work plan. And when we create dysfunction in the work plan, what do? We introduce hazards. So what does this have to do with interface management? Well, imagine several of these job triangles coming together and overlapping each other. And think about the residual hazards that arise from some of the less than ideal choices we have to make. Means that managing interface or synergistic hazards that come together when we're using work techniques that are incompatible with the environment that we're working in, which then causes major disasters that we've seen in the past. Interface management is exceedingly critical. Being able to look at these job designs in advance of them actually manifesting on site is so very important before we get to the point of execution. We cannot rely on traditional methods. Point of work risk assessments do not solve these problems. Behavioral-based observations do not solve these problems. Individual risk assessments prepared by individual contractors do not solve these problems. What solves these problems is making the right choices in the first place and evaluating the impact that these choices have on each other when we do have interface activities and simultaneous operations. This is the change in paradigm that's required within a market that has to grow as quickly as a renewable market is. And we are seeing some companies adopting these methods and performing exceedingly well, except not at the pace that is required. The other aspect that is so important, and most of you know this from your experience, is roles and responsibilities and delegation of duties. And often it's the lack of clarity around the way roles and responsibilities are determined and allocated that often creates confusion as to who's responsible for what on the ground. But it's not only delegation of duties that are a problem. The fact that we're not delegating duties early enough means that we are unable to do capability assessments as to whether those duties can actually be fulfilled, and then identify deficiencies early enough and close those deficiencies, because these deficiencies directly relate to the task skills that people require to undertake work, not just on the ground, not just at the sharp end, but also those who are planning work, also those who are scheduling work, also those who are making choices about which contractors to use and which contractors not to use. These skills are incredibly critical, but because delegation of duties are not happening early enough and in a sufficiently robust way, these have knock-on effects which affect not only safety, but quality and integrity too. Now remember, one of the key points that I talked about earlier on is, sorry, that's integration instead of integrity. One of the points I mentioned earlier on, which is critical for the sector, is the reliance on assets that offer us energy security. That is going to be quite critical if we're going to confidently move away from fossil into renewables. So if our work quality is compromised, which in turn impacts the integrity of our assets, we can only begin to imagine the concerns about ongoing energy security and the lack of flow of energy into our grid. And our winters, rather than being winters of joy during Christmas, will end up being winters of discontent. This is the impact that we as safety professionals can have on organizations such as these in order to ensure that our future is one that we continue to enjoy, but also sustainable for future generations. Majority of companies are looking for reduced LCOE, as I said before. That's a critical financial measure for them. And one of the ways of achieving reduced LCOE, guess what, is through optimizing resource, and that's often headcount. Now, I know that this is not unique to renewables. However, the growth of renewables means that it is going to be a problem that is exacerbated exponentially. So, working with minimal operational resources will have a direct impact on monitoring. And one of the opportunities that is really open to us as professionals is risk-based monitoring. And we can only implement risk-based monitoring with our clients on their sites if we have a predictive project plan to work to, together with a risk profile that we all trust and believe in. And that is the way we use our reduced resources well, rather than having to just monitor people on site as we do today. That produces good operational risk control based on the project plan and integrated master schedule. And essential to that is the early involvement of the supply chain in operational planning and mobilization. Far too often, the 5 to 10 years that we have to wait for an offshore wind farm to go from development into construction often means that we engage with parties on the basis of letters of engagement or letters of intent years before they actually put a pick to the ground. And in that time, as clients, we think that our contractors are busy preparing for executing our project. So that when we eventually sign the contract with them and we issue them the instruction to start tomorrow, they turn around and look at us and say, that ain't going to happen. Now, I am obviously exaggerating with that, but the point I'm trying to make is majority of investment organizations in the renewable sector do not seem to have a good enough understanding of the importance of the front-end engineering design process, nor do they have, therefore, a good enough understanding of the role that contractors have to play in it. Focusing on task, logistical, and work environment compatibility is absolutely crucial. We need to move away from the acceptance of hazards and risks and move into, and by virtue of accepting hazards and risks, focusing on reducing or mitigating them. We need to move deeper into the system and understand where hazards and risks come from. What are their precursors that exist in the decision making that we do? And the decision making that we do often results in the task, the work environment, and logistical arrangements coming together to form a hazard triangle such as that. At a project level, this is a really, really advantageous way of being able to eliminate or make better decisions that eliminate many of the pesky hazards that we have to end up spending time and resource managing. Not only would it result in a safer outcome, but also assets that are reliable. I've spent time talking about interface management, and we know about that already. And supply chain monitoring is equally important. Now, the current system of monitoring supply chains are quite interesting, looking at the standard leading and lagging indicators that we use. But we can find better ways of doing so. Instead of monitoring task control, we can monitor their work planning. And in addition to monitoring their work planning, we can monitor their resource allocation. We can monitor the jobs they complete on time. We can monitor the delivery of their equipment on time. All of those are precursors to hazards which are created as a result of loss of front-end control. So supply chain monitoring can become far more tactical in nature when looking for leading safety KPIs than the traditional ones that we use today. And finally, in terms of looking at how projects are delivered across their life cycle, risk-based monitoring is really about quality, not about the number of monitoring activities we've done or how many client representatives we have on site. By quality, what I mean specifically is monitoring whether the task-related controls are being implemented when they should. And we do this by ensuring that our assessments of risks are relevant to the jobs that they cover, which most often than not isn't the case. But there are some indicators that we are seeing from accidents and incidents in offshore and onshore development that give us a huge hint as to how we really ought to arrange our monitoring and focus on monitoring. And the key phases are in setup. Did you know of, you probably wouldn't know, but in my experience, whilst the evidence is merely anecdotal, but if I were to look at any activity, there I can divide them into 3 simple phases. You have your setup phase, you have your actual work execution phase, and then you have your clear up or commissioning and clear up phase. Of the fatalities that I have investigated, did you know that around 86% of them actually happen during the setup phase. And by looking at data such as this tells us that mobilization work is not managed really well, nor is it planned very well, so we can focus our attention on setup. Projects such as these often tend to work 24/7 in some instances in some countries. One of the key risks takes place, or key risks emerge during cross-shift handovers, so we can allocate our rather lean monitoring resources to cross-shift control, or interface work involving multiple parties, or indeed during the most dangerous of phases in our asset lifecycle, which is commissioning and testing, when we suddenly turn the switch on and connect all of those bits you saw in an earlier slide. If we undertake proactive evaluations such as this, it tells us in advance how many resources we need and when they need to go out and monitor. And as I said, focus your monitoring on task controls rather than housekeeping and PPE is certainly going to demonstrate whether the system that lies within the construction safety plan is actually working or not. The last thing that I want to share with you before I conclude my presentation is the interpretation of the safe system of work that I spoke to you about earlier on. So this is the triangle of the right people, right number of people with the right skills, doing the right tasks with the right tools at the right place at the right time. These are the input factors, because the manner in which one goes about determining these inputs and selecting these inputs will tell you what the outcome is going to be, not only from a safety perspective, but also from a quality and an effectiveness perspective. And when we look deeper into an organization and ask ourselves, what are the decision points that give rise to people, task, and work environment decisions, you can see very clearly from this particular slide that these decision-making points are quite critical in creating that system of work. And overlaying that with the duty holder roles within CDM, you can see what an interesting mishmash there is, and therefore the importance of getting these roles and responsibilities aligned as early as development, well before we even hit construction. Lifecycle information management within renewables, like any process-based asset, is absolutely critical. And often the 5 to 10 year pre-construction period, as well as the 5-year construction period thereafter, causes this information flow to lose continuity all the way through. And in doing so, the poor O&M team are receiving asset and handover information and as-built drawings that are incomplete. And as a result of that, it's almost like starting all over again. It's rather disappointing. In summary, this is an incredibly exciting market because it is growing at the rate of knots, pardon the pun, but growing technologically in ways that just beg us belief. My respect goes out to engineers and designers in this market because they are changing the world within a matter of 2 decades. The approach to regulation needs to change. We need to move away from our minimalistic approach to regulation and start adopting a life cycle mentality towards it. Because in doing so, we are doing so much more than just protecting people, we're securing our future. And the way we need to do that is by adopting consistent and holistic business decision-making and processes, not ignoring those precursors that exist which create hazards on the ground that we have to try and get our line management to manage. Design is so much more than a safety tool. It absolutely helps a project to run on time and on budget if it's planned well. It's also operationally sensitive because it allows the O&M team to take control of an asset that they understand well because of the data that's provided to them. The opportunity for safety professionals are immense, hopefully, as a result of the slides that I've covered with you so far. Think in life cycle terms. This is a long game, 35 years plus per project. And hopefully I've given you some ideas as to how we can utilize safety to add value by driving performance. I'd like to thank you very much for your time, and you're most welcome to ask questions.
Thank you, Rakesh. Dylan, have we got any questions?
There are no current questions in the chat function at the moment.
Oh, there you go. I've got, yeah, looking at what you've said, especially with, I mean, the safe work packs, Network Rail use safe work packs across their industry, and most of our assets are life expected 40 years. How do you think that we can build in better? Because one of the biggest problems we have is that scope change right at the beginning, where different people have different ideas of what they want to get out of it. And in amongst the middle of that is that value engineering.
Yes, that's a very, very interesting question. It's a slightly different dynamic to start with. I mean, presuming we're not talking about HS2, Network Rail has aging assets.
That's right, yes.
You have legacy that you're working with, as well as then asset modification in terms of capital investment improvement works you're doing. Work packs themselves are really helpful, but they're only helpful insofar as we're able to get that high-level system of work right in terms of the choices that we make. And the manner in which we ought to do so is by helping our decision makers recognize that the change of scope does not only impact safety on the ground, but impacts their bottom line in terms of cost management, in terms of supply chain attrition and attention, and in terms of quality of work. Because ultimately, for projects like the one that you'd be working with, Keith, I suspect that your drivers are going to be safety, quality, time, and cost. And if we are able to demonstrate to those who are making scope decisions how last-minute scope changes affect every single one of those 4 indicators, then we will get them to sit up and listen.
Okay. Yep, I can see that.
We now have a question in the chat from Brian. Brian, would you care to unmute yourself and ask your question personally?
Yeah, sure, I can do that. Rakesh, really interesting presentation and fascinating, actually, insight. And for somebody who's going into the renewables industry, it's going to be a real eye-opener when taking this information in. And I think sharing it up the chain is going to be so important. But I suppose my question, what I'm seeing is that because the industry is growing so quickly, they're having to pull resources in from places like the oil and gas industry or construction industry. So what you're basically doing is you're pulling in maybe people that don't have initially direct experience in the industry first off, but equally coming in with maybe multiple different cultures from different industries who have built up, strong safety cultures within those. So you're getting that mix coming together. Not only at a lower level, but also at a senior executive level where some of these decisions will be made. Are you seeing that as an issue? Are you seeing that as a potential good thing or bad thing? I'd be interested in your viewpoint on that, and how would you address it?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for an incredibly well-considered question, and your compliments in advance as well. Thank you. But very well-considered question and a very relevant one affecting the industry. This is an incredibly insightful question for so many reasons. The characterization of the mix of cultures that you just set out is absolutely accurate, but I want to add one more to that. And that is the custom and practice of historical utility industry who are suddenly now trying to develop assets in 1/10 the amount of time with 1/5 the amount of people. So you've got those who are supposedly experts in coal and gas now trying to develop wind and solar assets in a completely different environment. And that in itself requires a substantive mindset change. Now, my opinion, and based on my experience, is that traveling down the safety culture route can be dangerous. And the reason that it can be dangerous is because what we're trying to do is we're trying to ultimately achieve a degree of homogeneousness, if there's such a word. We're trying to homogenize cultures to establish one that is more renewable centric. Now, in my view, that is going to take decades to happen, well beyond 2050. And trying to tackle safety culture as a lever to bring about positive change within the marketplace is not going to work within the short term. What I do believe we can address, and address relatively quickly, are how businesses that are the manner in which businesses make decisions and why they make decisions, as my entire presentation focused on. I mean, ultimately, most stakeholders within the energy sector, renewable or otherwise, are driven by two key drivers. Number one is the financial return, and secondly, energy security. So we can use those two to establish an organizational culture within these businesses that make informed decisions, equipping them to understand how they're going to affect control on the ground if they pick a multi-contract versus an EPC model to deliver a project, for example. So it's about working high up in the organization, looking at those hazard precursors, and working with management to understand what are the medium to long-term issues that they are creating if they make certain key strategic and tactical decisions today. And I think that's how we go about changing the culture within these businesses in such a way that controlled work activity delivers safe outcomes. Now, you might call that a safety culture, that's fine, but I tend to call that an organizational culture. Hopefully that's given you a sense of my opinion on this.
Yeah, no, interesting answer, and you're absolutely right. You know, trying to change a culture in an organization or develop a culture in an organization is a long-term strategy if you go down that route. Yeah, but interesting, you're focusing on the decision process. The culture around that process is a key driver. So yeah, good insight. Thank you.
Okay. Any more questions there, Dylan?
No, there are no questions at present. And I just have to go and tend to somebody that's making my dogs go absolutely nuts at the moment. Give me 30 seconds. Apologies all.
Okay. So thank you very much, Rakesh. A very interesting presentation. Lots to think about. 40 million people. I wonder how many of those you've considered will be safety professionals.
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. With no disrespect for our incredibly altruistic profession, my take is that the fewer the better. And this is only because it would demonstrate our success in being able to get safety delivered through the line, not through the reliance on safety professionals that they do today.
But to do that, you need to make sure it's designed in at every stage, and competence within safety is taken rather than seen as an external resource.
100%. And perhaps then that does lead us to the next question, which is, what does the new generation safety professional look like?
Very true. So thank you very much for your time. Great presentation, as I said, very thought-provoking. Thank you.
Very much. And you do have my slides, and I've noticed that there are a few people who are asking for copies of those, so you're welcome to distribute that.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now that the dogs have quietened down, I do apologize for that for everybody. It's typical, isn't it? You couldn't write this. I will now share my screen. What we're going to do is through our presentations and topics, we are linking the topics. So hopefully somebody can give me a nod that we can see the competency framework. Brilliant. What we do is we link the topic of each event into our competency framework, and how that then can reflect, how you can reflect rather, on what's been delivered today, take context into your world of occupational safety and health, and take the tips for getting your CPD through this framework. Sure, we've all seen this wheel many times before, where our 12 elements are then further split down into a total of 69. So when we look at today, the safety in context of a renewable energy and asset life cycles perspective, if we look at both the technical, behavioral, and the core. If we look at the technical competencies, a lot of what was talked about today was talking about the legislation and how the legislative frameworks fit in with our occupational safety and health legal requirements, and its consideration of what your work streams do and what legislation fits into there, and the review of those. All of these can make great CPD events. And the risk management, risk identification, and probably risk mitigation. If we start to analyze the effectiveness of our risk reduction within our own businesses and works, the planning, the planning and the mitigation of risks, as Rakesh referred to there, 86% of incidents and fatalities investigated are during the setup phases. A lot of focus goes into the actual project, but what about the actual setting up when we're not fully up to speed and we're not fully set up and not everything's in place? Great food for thought. If we look at sustainability and the culture, leadership, management expectations, what is expected by our leaders and managers? Is it feasible? Is it buildable? What input do we have as safety professionals in these early stages? And as we said, that is going to be key to the outcomes. We saw the hazard triangle. Again, bring that back into our businesses. And again, all these events are excellent events that you could actually use as CPD to demonstrate your competency. So if we move on to the core competencies, the strategy and development and planning. So how does the asset lifecycle link with financial management? How much do we as safety professionals get involved in that? I know from a personal perspective, not as much as I'd like to. Again, for me, there's a goal, and I've already sat here today. It's already made me think I need to be looking more into this going forwards. And again, through our CPD, it's an excellent opportunity to have an item in there under transferable management skills. And then finally, looking at the behavioral competencies, working with others, the commercial mindset. A lot of today where we saw it's a front end up is heavy commercial. We saw the 5 years of commercial aspects and the planning and everything before we even get to ground. That's a huge impact. How much of that 5 years do we as safety professionals do? And when we're out there on the behavioral competencies, it's very key that what Rakesh referred to today is, are we still looking for the person who hasn't got the hard hat on? Are we still looking for the person who's not wearing glasses? Or are we looking at culture versus compliance? So where is our focus? All of these potentially food for thought on items that you could use for demonstrating your competency through the IOSH competency framework. I hope that makes sense to everybody. Does anybody have any questions on that? Feel free to shout out. I'll take silence as acquiescence. Moving on swiftly. Okay. As part of our sessions, what we're doing, we're giving attendees the opportunity to engage with the committee, ask questions of the committee. We do have some questions that have already come in that I will pose. I am going to stop sharing so we can all see each other when we are speaking, if that is any better. So if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask the committee, please either raise your hand or post them in the chat function now. So our first question, and if I can pose this one to Keith, please. Whilst it's great that you are now linking the topics at these events into the competency framework, will you be holding any dedicated workshops to assist the membership in getting to grips with the framework when it's formally released?
That's a really good question. Strangely enough, our next session is about IOSH competencies, and we'll be looking at that sort of thing in more detail. As people have noticed who've attend these calls regularly, we do update and have introduced the new competency wheel to help guide people in where it sits within CPD and to help bring it into focus that people can use it to gain the knowledge and the understanding.
Excellent.
Paul, anything to add from your side?
Yeah, I mean, I think, once we get into the new year, once things are, officially signed off, I think obviously we're going to be looking at that whole package around supporting members around the new changes, membership growth, etc. So that'll be hopefully sometime early in the new year.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. And as you're in the seat, are there any updates on the proposed ethics certificate?
That will again is still part of the rollout of the change, and we're still waiting on a number of things to be formally approved. And again, that will be in the new year, and that will form part of all the changes. And as I say, the IOSH team are busy preparing to roll out a whole support piece around that as well. So that will be included within that.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Tudor, one for you, if I may. Louise Hosking is the new IOSH president. Please, could you tell us more about her and what her focus will be for the year ahead?
Okay, yeah, I know Louise, and she's been a good friend of the branch in her early days as a vice president, and pleasure to see her now in the position of president. There's a couple of strap lines that she's already put out there from the AGM a week ago, and one quote: "People, sustainability, and putting the heart into health and safety." And we're not going to talk at this at length about what all those mean, and certainly they will be explained to us as the membership as we go forward. But what I would say is that Louise is very, like all presidents, to be very, very clear about what she thinks what the membership needs and what the membership should be doing. And there's a lot of continuity in moving on from Jimmy Quinn's year, and that'll be carried forward. And I think what we're going to see as membership and Louise is her being very, very clear and very much explaining to us as membership what that means. We won't have to guess. And in terms of people, we're talking about, she talks a lot about social sustainability. And if you look at her, and we put some of these links up as well, I believe, Dylan, to some of the things that are available at the moment, is just putting people first, caring about how they feel and how we create inclusivity in the workplace. And she believes that health and safety in organizations will be better if we do that. The nuts and bolts of it will will be explained to us, but certainly that's the main themes that you're going to find from Louise this year. And one other final thing, she tends to use a lot of the term saving lives one conversation at a time. Some people might have experienced that with Louise already, and she's very much trying to get people just to discuss health and safety and keep it on the agenda and keep it front and central.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
The next question we have, we see that there are 3 new vice presidents of IOSH. Please could you advise on the purpose of the presidential team and the roles of the vice presidents? Keith, Paul, who'd like to jump on that one?
So the vice presidents are there to help support the president and act as a team to attend events, promote IOSH as a worldwide organisation. Doesn't mean to say we're going to get them at every event, but they do pop up more frequently than was the case in past years. And there is actually a presidential page, I believe, Paul, isn't there, on the IOSH website about what they're doing and what they're up to?
Yes, Keith, I've just dropped that in the chat function so you can have a link, click on that link there. It should give you a bit more information around the presidential team's makeup, the individuals and some of their aims and purposes as well. I know they're very keen to come out and speak to members, and I'm sure we'll be seeing them at various IOSH branch meetings in South Wales in the coming year as well. So have a look at that. And I've also just dropped the link in there for the IOSH Catch the Wave campaign as well, which is just touching on some of the things that Tudor mentioned there around social sustainability. So have a look at that. And again, any questions, come back to us and we can provide you a bit more detail from there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul. And the final question that I have, are there any plans to hold collaborative events with other IOSH branches in the near future?
Andrew's the best person to answer that one because he hasn't said anything.
Thank you, Keith. Yes, we've, where we can, we've consulted and collaborated with other branches to see if there is a commonality of events. However, we've been very focused on membership feedback at the moment and trying to provide our events in line with that feedback. However, we will keep our eye on the horizon and look for any other branch who do or are going to promote topics that are in line with our membership feedback, and in which case we will collaborate.
Paul, anything for
yeah,
that?
can you add on to that? Yeah, obviously, you know, in terms of we are very much focused on us as a region as well. So we're regionally, we're looking at trying to collaborate with the other branches within our region as well. I think it makes sense, you know, to make sure we're not duplicating topics and we're providing things that the whole region wants. So, but also IOSH more widely, I think we're looking at collaboration, not just within ourselves, but outside as well. So I think there'll be a good focus on what else we can do and work with others going forward to give members the best possible value.
Excellent. Thank you, everyone. There are all the questions that I have. Are there any other questions from any attendees in the meeting today? Feel free to unmute and jump in. I will take that as a no at this time. If you do feel of any questions, our link to our email will be coming up shortly. Please feel free, if there's anything you think of after the meeting, please feel free to drop us a line and we'll get back to you. Keith, I shall share screen and hand over to you to close our meeting.
Thank you, Noel. So thank you all for taking the time to attend. Thanks to Rakesh, I know he's now left, and everyone else for sharing your knowledge and experience. We look forward to welcoming you all to our next meeting and moving forward to us as a branch with face-to-face. Please take the time to complete the short post-event survey, as your feedback is what helps us shape future events, and we truly value it. Please stay safe, stay well, and stay connected. Thank you.